It was 1:40 a.m. on a transoceanic flight. The cabin lights were dimmed. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed down the aisle. An elderly passenger had collapsed. A flight attendant dropped to her knees, her voice trembling over the PA system. "Is there a doctor on board? We have a medical emergency." The entire cabin remained perfectly silent. In a cramped middle seat, a 7-year-old girl gripped her father's hand in terror. The father looked down at her. He used to wear a white coat. He used to save lives, and then he stood up. The fate of a dying stranger rested in his hands. His name was Dr. Aaron Mitchell, 43 years old, with tired, kind eyes that carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of someone who had seen too much loss, and a quiet, unassuming posture that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the background. He was a single father. His entire universe, his absolute priority in life, was his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily was currently sitting right next to him, clutching a stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. She was incredibly afraid of flying. The claustrophobia, the strange noises, the occasional stomach-dropping jolts of turbulence, it all terrified her. She would only ever fall asleep on an airplane if Aaron was sitting right beside her, holding her small hand, acting as her immovable, unbreakable shield against the world. Aaron wasn't a corporate executive. He wasn't a businessman traveling for a high-stakes meeting. He was, by training and by nature, a brilliant internal medicine physician. For over a decade, he had been one of the most respected, heavily relied upon attending doctors at a massive, chaotic, high-volume city hospital. He had lived his life in the trenches of the emergency room and the intensive care unit. He was used to the frantic screaming of monitors, the smell of sterile iodine, and the crushing life-or-death pressure of making split-second medical decisions while standing over a dying patient. But 3 years ago, the doctor's world had completely, violently shattered. His wife, a vibrant and beautiful woman, had passed away after a sudden aggressive illness. The loss completely devastated Aaron. Suddenly, the grueling, unpredictable lifestyle of a senior hospital physician, the endless 80-hour work weeks, the agonizing 36-hour overnight on-call shifts, the holidays spent pacing the hospital corridors instead of being at home, became entirely, physically impossible. Aaron realized with terrifying clarity that Lily had already lost her mother. She could not afford to lose her father to the relentless demands of the hospital system. She needed a parent who was actually there to make her breakfast, to walk her to school, to read her bedtime stories, and to hold her hand when she was scared. So Dr. Aaron Mitchell made the ultimate, heartbreaking sacrifice. He walked into the chief of medicine's office, handed over his hospital badge, and stepped away from clinical practice. He folded up his white coat and put it in a box in the back of his closet. He didn't abandon medicine entirely. He retained his active, fully updated medical license, but he transitioned to a quiet, remote, low-stress role as a part-time medical consultant for an insurance firm. It was boring. It was unfulfilling. It was a massive waste of his incredible clinical talent, but it allowed him to be a full-time, dedicated father. And to Aaron, that was the only title that actually mattered anymore. Now they were thousands of miles from home, suspended 35,000 feet in the air over the pitch-black, freezing Atlantic Ocean. Most of the passengers on the red-eye flight were fast asleep under thin polyester blankets. Aaron was awake, quietly reading a book on his tablet, his left hand gently holding Lily's hand as she finally dozed off against his shoulder. Then the terrifying, heavy thud occurred just 3 rows ahead of them. The frantic, desperate voice of the lead flight attendant cracked over the intercom, shattering the peaceful silence of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a medical emergency. If there is a licensed physician on board, please ring your call button immediately." The heavy, suffocating silence that followed the announcement was deafening. Wealthy passengers in business class peeked over their seats, looking around nervously. People in economy murmured, hoping someone else would take the responsibility. Nobody stood up. Nobody rang their bell. Aaron froze in his seat. His heart began to pound against his ribs. The old, deeply ingrained instincts of an emergency room doctor surged through his veins like electricity. His brain immediately began running through triage algorithms, but his body remained anchored to the seat. He hesitated. He looked down at Lily. If he stood up, he would have to let go of her hand. He would have to expose himself to the chaos, the pressure, and the immense crushing legal and moral liability of practicing medicine in a pressurized metal tube with zero proper equipment. He had walked away from this life. He wasn't a hero anymore. He was just a dad. He hesitated for exactly 3 agonizing seconds. The movement woke Lily. She rubbed her tired eyes and looked at the commotion up the aisle. She saw the panicked flight attendant kneeling over the fallen man. Then she looked up at her father. She saw the intense, conflicted look in his eyes. She knew her dad better than anyone in the world. She knew what he used to do. Lily gently slipped her small hand out of his tight grip. She looked him dead in the eye, her voice soft but incredibly steady. "Go, Dad. He needs you." Aaron stared at his brave little girl. He let out a deep, heavy breath, releasing the fear and the doubt. He reached over and unbuckled his seatbelt with a sharp click. He didn't panic. He didn't run wildly down the aisle screaming for people to move. He stood up, his posture radically transforming from a tired single father into a commanding, focused medical professional. He stepped out of his row and walked calmly, purposefully toward the front of the plane. Aaron pushed his way through the gathering, whispering crowd of terrified passengers. "Excuse me. Move, please." "Let me through," Aaron said, his voice deep, authoritative, and leaving absolutely zero room for debate. He reached the front of the economy cabin. An elderly man, roughly 70 years old, was lying completely motionless on his back in the narrow aisle. His face was a terrifying, ashen shade of gray. His eyes were rolled back, and his jaw was slack. A frail, terrified woman, his wife, was kneeling beside him, weeping hysterically, shaking his shoulders. Richard, please wake up. Somebody help him." The flight attendant looked up at Aaron with wide, desperate eyes. "Are you a doctor, sir?" "I am an internal medicine physician," Aaron stated clearly, instantly taking absolute command of the chaotic situation. "Clear this aisle. I need space. Get these passengers back to their seats right now." He didn't wait for her to act. He dropped to both knees directly on the hard carpeted floor of the aircraft. The intense, hyper-focused clinical tunnel vision immediately took over his brain. He shut out the roar of the jet engines, the crying wife, and the staring eyes of 100 strangers. "Ma'am, I am a doctor," Aaron said, his voice incredibly calm and grounding, looking directly at the panicked wife. "I am going to help him, but I need you to focus and answer my questions quickly. Does he have a history of cardiovascular disease? Has he ever had a heart attack?" "Yes," she sobbed, clutching her chest. "He has a stent. He takes blood pressure medication. Is he dying? Oh God, is he having a heart attack?" Aaron didn't answer her panic with empty promises. He went straight to the primary assessment: airway, breathing, circulation. He leaned down, placing his ear near the elderly man's mouth while simultaneously watching his chest for movement. He couldn't feel any air escaping the man's lips, and the chest was incredibly still. Aaron immediately pressed 2 fingers firmly against the man's carotid artery on the side of his neck. The entire cabin watched in horrified, breathless anticipation. Some passengers were already expecting a dramatic Hollywood-style scene where the doctor violently rips open the man's shirt and begins delivering bone-crushing CPR chest compressions or screaming for a defibrillator to shock his heart. But real medicine is rarely cinematic. It is calculated. It is precise. Aaron closed his eyes, focusing entirely on the tactile sensation in his fingertips. There it was. It was incredibly faint, thready, and dangerously slow, but it was absolutely there. "I have a pulse," Aaron announced loudly to the flight crew. "He is not in cardiac arrest. Do not bring the AED. Do not start compressions. If you compress a beating heart, you will cause a fatal arrhythmia." He looked up at the lead flight attendant. "I need the Advanced Emergency Medical Kit, EMK, right now. And I need your portable oxygen cylinder set to maximum flow. Move." The flight attendant scrambled away, returning seconds later with a heavy red medical bag and a green oxygen tank. "Call the flight deck," Aaron ordered without looking up, his hands moving rapidly. Have the captain immediately connect with your ground-based medical advisory service, MedAir, or whichever company you use. Tell them you have a physician on board assessing a 70-year-old male with a cardiac history, currently unconscious, presenting with profound bradycardia, and suspected severe hypertension. Aaron expertly cracked open the red medical kit. It was limited, but it had the basics. He quickly grabbed a manual sphygmomanometer, a blood pressure cuff, and a stethoscope. He wrapped the cuff tightly around the elderly man's frail arm, placed the stethoscope earpieces into his ears, and pumped the bulb. The ambient noise of the airplane made it incredibly difficult to hear the subtle Korotkoff sounds of the blood pumping, but Aaron's years of working in chaotic emergency rooms had trained his ears perfectly. He released the valve, watching the dial drop. Blood pressure is dangerously low, 70/40, Aaron reported grimly. He's experiencing a massive syncopal episode, likely vagal, possibly secondary to a silent cardiac event. His brain isn't getting enough oxygenated blood. He didn't inject random drugs. He didn't perform a dramatic procedure. He relied on simple, highly effective medical physics. "Help me move him," Aaron instructed two male flight attendants who were hovering nearby. "We need to get his legs elevated above his heart to force the pooling blood back to his brain, and we need to roll him slightly onto his left recovery side to protect his airway in case he aspirates." Working together in the incredibly cramped space, they carefully repositioned the heavy, unconscious man. Aaron secured the oxygen mask tightly over the man's pale face, turning the flow valve to maximum. The loud hissing of pure oxygen filled the quiet aisle. Aaron stayed on his knees, his fingers resting constantly on the man's radial pulse at the wrist, monitoring the rhythm like a hawk. 2 minutes passed. It felt like an absolute eternity. The wife continued to weep softly into her hands. Then the man's eyelids began to flutter. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp, pulling in the pure, concentrated oxygen. His chest heaved. The terrifying ashen gray color of his skin slowly began to recede, replaced by a faint, returning flush of pink. He opened his eyes, looking around in utter, disoriented confusion at the ceiling of the airplane. "Richard!" his wife screamed, collapsing over him in relief. Aaron gently placed a hand on her shoulder, pulling her back slightly to give the man air. "He's back with us, but he is not stable." The lead flight attendant kneeled next to Aaron, holding a radio handset with a long cord connected to the cockpit. "Doctor, the captain is on the line. He's talking to the ground medical team. They want your recommendation. We are exactly halfway across the ocean. We can continue to our destination, which is 4 hours away, or we can declare a medical emergency and divert to the nearest major airport in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is 45 minutes away." Aaron looked at the frail man on the floor. His pulse was back, but it was irregular. His blood pressure was still critically low. If he experienced a secondary cardiac event over the middle of the ocean, Aaron had absolutely no medications, no advanced life support equipment, and no surgical options to save him. Aaron didn't hesitate. He didn't worry about the inconvenience of the other 300 passengers. He didn't worry about the airline's fuel costs. He made the only responsible clinical decision possible. "Tell the captain to turn the plane around," Aaron said, his voice absolute. "We are diverting. He needs a cardiac catheterization lab, and he needs it right now. Get us on the ground. CTA QY Act 2. If you firmly believe that true, life-saving skill is proven not when you have a massive hospital behind you, but when you have absolutely nothing but your bare hands and your knowledge, hit that subscribe button to witness what happens when the massive jet abruptly changes course in the dead of night. The massive, heavily loaded commercial jet suddenly banked sharply to the left. The distinct, terrifying sensation of the aircraft altering its course in the middle of the night sent a wave of nervous whispers rippling through the crowded cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom, sounding tense but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. Due to a critical medical emergency, we have declared a priority situation with air traffic control and are currently diverting our flight path to Halifax. We will be initiating a rapid descent shortly. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened. In the aisle, the situation remained incredibly fragile. Aaron refused to move. The flight attendants offered him a comfortable seat in first class, begging him to get off the hard floor. He declined immediately. For the next 45 agonizing minutes, Aaron remained kneeling on the thin, uncomfortable carpet of the airplane aisle, right next to Richard. He didn't leave the patient's side for a single second. He continuously monitored Richard's pulse, checking his blood pressure every 5 minutes with the manual cuff, ensuring the oxygen mask remained perfectly sealed over the man's face. He was operating purely on adrenaline and muscle memory. Richard's wife, Margaret, sat on the floor opposite Aaron, her hands trembling violently. "Is he going to make it, doctor?" Margaret asked, her voice cracking with pure, desperate terror. "Please tell me he's going to be okay." This was the hardest part of medicine. This was the part they didn't teach you in textbooks, the management of human despair. Aaron didn't offer her false hope. He didn't give her a magical Hollywood guarantee that everything was perfectly fine, because he didn't know if it was. He was an honest physician, and he respected his patients enough to tell them the unvarnished truth. "Margaret," Aaron said softly, maintaining incredibly steady, empathetic eye contact with her. "His blood pressure is currently stable, and he is breathing on his own with the supplemental oxygen. Those are very good signs. However, his heart experienced a significant trauma, and his rhythm is irregular. I cannot promise you anything until we get him into a fully equipped trauma center, but I can absolutely promise you this. I am not going to leave his side until we are on the ground, and I hand him over to the paramedics. You are not alone in this." Margaret nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but she seemed marginally comforted by his profound, grounded honesty. Back in row 18, Lily sat completely alone in the dark. The turbulence was getting rough as the massive plane descended through a heavy weather system. The aircraft bounced and shuddered violently. Lily gripped her stuffed rabbit so hard her knuckles ached. She was terrified. She wanted her dad more than anything in the world. She wanted to cry out for him, but she didn't. She looked up the aisle and saw her father's broad back as he knelt over the sick man. She saw the intense, focused way he was working. She remembered the stories her dad used to tell her about the hospital, about how he helped fix broken people. She knew he was doing something incredibly important. A flight attendant named Sarah noticed the young girl sitting all by herself, looking frightened but forcing herself to be brave. Sarah grabbed a small bottle of water and a packet of cookies and walked over to Lily's row. "Hi, sweetie," Sarah whispered gently, crouching down next to the seat. "Are you Dr. Mitchell's daughter?" Lily nodded slowly, biting her lip. "Your dad is an incredibly brave man," Sarah said, handing her the snacks. "He's saving that man's life up there. You must be very proud of him." Lily looked at the water bottle, then looked back up the aisle. "He's the smartest guy in the whole world," she whispered proudly. The heavy jet broke through the cloud cover, the bright lights of the Halifax runway appearing violently fast in the dark window. The captain had executed a maximum rate descent. The landing gear slammed down with a heavy, mechanical clunk. The plane hit the runway hard, the massive thrust reversers roaring furiously as the pilot fought to slow the heavy, fuel-laden aircraft down before they ran out of tarmac. The moment the plane taxied to a halt at a remote emergency gate, the main cabin doors were thrown open. A team of heavily equipped airport paramedics, carrying stretchers, defibrillators, and trauma bags, sprinted onto the aircraft. They rushed down the aisle to where Aaron was waiting. Aaron didn't step back immediately. He executed a flawless, incredibly dense, and highly structured clinical handover. 70-year-old male, experienced a massive syncopal episode with profound bradycardia 40 minutes ago. Aaron barked to the lead paramedic, speaking their rapid-fire medical language. History of cardiac stenting and hypertension. Blood pressure bottomed out at 70/40. No CPR initiated. Maintained airway via recovery position and administered high-flow O2. Current BP is 100/60. Pulse is 85 but irregular. He needs a 12-lead ECG and transport to a cardiac cath lab immediately. The paramedics nodded, instantly grasping the severity of the situation without having to ask a single clarifying question. They rapidly transferred Richard onto a flexible transport stretcher and began moving him toward the exit. Margaret grabbed her purse and followed them. Just before she reached the door, she stopped and turned back to Aaron. She reached into her bag, frantically trying to pull out a thick stack of cash or a platinum business card. "Doctor, please let me compensate you," she cried out. "I want to give you something. I want to reward you." Aaron gently raised his hand, shaking his head with a tired, genuine smile. "Keep your money, Margaret. Focus entirely on your husband. Tell the hospital doctors what I told you. Go." Margaret looked at him with profound, absolute gratitude, then rushed out the door behind the stretcher. Aaron stood alone in the aisle for a moment. His knees ached terribly from kneeling on the hard floor. His shirt was wrinkled and soaked with nervous sweat. He let out a long, heavy, shuddering exhale, feeling the massive adrenaline dump finally leaving his system, leaving him exhausted. He turned around and began the long walk back down the aisle toward his seat. He expected the passengers to be angry about the massive delay in the diverted flight. He expected complaints. Instead, as he walked past the first row of business class, an older man slowly stood up and began to clap. It wasn't a roaring, theatrical, stadium-level standing ovation. It was a slow, respectful, incredibly quiet applause. Then a woman across the aisle joined in, then the people in the exit row. Within seconds, the entire cabin of 300 stranded, exhausted passengers was clapping softly, offering a profound, silent tribute of pure respect to the man in the faded shirt. Aaron felt his face flush with embarrassment. He wasn't doing it for the applause. He kept his head down, nodding politely, and hurried back to row 18. He slid into his seat and immediately pulled his seatbelt across his lap. Lily looked at him. She didn't look scared anymore. Aaron wrapped his arm around her small shoulders, pulling her tightly against his side, burying his face in her hair. "I'm sorry I left you alone, sweetie. I'm right here now." Lily leaned her head heavily against his chest. She wrapped her arms around his waist. "It's okay, Dad," Lily whispered, her voice full of an understanding far beyond her years. "You didn't hesitate. I knew you wouldn't." The diverted plane was refueled, and they eventually landed at their destination exhausted the following morning. Aaron and Lily went back to their quiet life. Aaron returned to his consulting job. He didn't post about the incident or call the news. He had done his duty, and that was the end of it. But Destiny was flying in business class that night. A week later, Aaron received a highly unusual email. The sender was from the executive board of City General, one of the most prestigious medical research hospitals in the state. "Dr. Mitchell, my name is Dr. Eris Thorne. I am the Chief Medical Director at City General. I was sitting in seat 4A on your flight last week. I watched you take absolute control of a terrifying environment without a single piece of advanced equipment. I pulled your old residency files. You were a brilliant internal medicine attending before you voluntarily surrendered your privileges to care for your daughter. I am writing to offer you an open door. A hospital is a machine, but it requires human intuition to heal. We need doctors like you. I am offering you a fully flexible, part-time, non-emergent clinical role. You choose your hours, no overnight shifts. Please consider it." Aaron sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the screen. His heart ached. He missed the intellectual challenge and the profound feeling of saving a life. But he looked at the living room, where Lily was building a Lego castle. Going back meant giving up some control over their schedule. He closed the laptop with a heavy sigh. He walked in and sat next to her. "Hey, kiddo, I got an email from a hospital boss. He saw what I did on the airplane and wants me to come back and be a real doctor again part-time." Lily stopped building. "Are you going to do it?" "No," Aaron forced a smile. "I don't want to miss your school plays. Being your dad is my real job." Lily frowned and placed her small hand on his arm. "Dad," Lily said seriously, "when that man fell down on the plane, everybody else was too scared to move. If you don't go back, who is going to help the other people when they fall down?" Aaron swallowed hard. "There are other doctors, Lily." "But they aren't you," she insisted. "You can help people and still be my dad. I can do my homework at the hospital cafeteria. I promise I'll be quiet." Aaron stared at his incredibly wise daughter. The heavy wall of guilt that had kept him away from medicine instantly crumbled. He pulled her into a massive hug, tears finally brimming. "Okay, kiddo, let's go fix some people." 2 weeks later, Dr. Aaron Mitchell walked through the sliding glass doors of City General Hospital, wearing a crisp white coat for the first time in 36 months. He negotiated a strict 3-day schedule from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., allowing him to drop Lily off and pick her up. He hadn't compromised his family or his gift. A month into his new role, a small envelope arrived at Aaron's apartment. Inside was an elegant, handwritten thank you card from London. "Dear Dr. Mitchell, Richard is finally home and fully recovered. The surgeons told us that if you hadn't positioned him correctly and recognized the blood pressure drop without relying on a machine, he would have suffered a fatal stroke. We owe you the rest of our lives. Thank you for standing up when the world went dark. Forever grateful, Margaret." There was no massive check enclosed. Margaret Hale knew a man like Aaron couldn't be bought. There were no news headlines. The world kept spinning, unaware of the miracle over the Atlantic. But for Aaron, everything had changed. He realized his medical degree wasn't just a job title he could resign from. It was a fundamental part of his humanity. When the panicked question, "Is there a doctor on the plane?" rang out through that dark cabin, Aaron hadn't just answered with a professional title. He had answered with a profound, unyielding moral responsibility. He had learned that you don't have to choose between being a hero to the world and being a hero to your child. Sometimes, by simply doing the right thing, you end up being exactly what both of them desperately need. If you firmly believe that true skill only has genuine meaning when it's used bravely at the exact right moment, hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories of quiet courage winning in the end. Tell us in the comments down below. If you were sitting on an airplane and heard a call for emergency help, would you have the courage to stand up, or would you hope someone else did it first?